Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Bienvenidos a todos. Boirun. It's so great to have you for the last in our wonderful four-part series, Sephardim from the Medieval to the Modern, with Rabbi Dr. Mark Angel. It's a little bittersweet, un picado, we say. It's a pity that we have to end with this wonderful series, but we've been so honored and privileged to have our dear friend Rabbi Angel do this really beautiful series that's really spanned such a long history of Sephardic Judaism through his books and his writings. And we're so grateful that you all have joined us these past 4 weeks for this great series. If you're interested in finding out about more of our series, we have many other classes as well on Sephardic cooking, Ladino language, history, culture, Sephardic Torah, Halakha. You can check out our website, sephardicbrother.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. And if you want to see other series like this as well, we're going to send out a poll right before the end of the class into the chat and via email. Please take the poll and give us some feedback about this series and others. Let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your feedback to make sure we can always improve Avagar, we say in Ladino. The last thing I'll note that this is a nonprofit initiative. We do depend on your support. If you're ever interested in making a donation or sponsoring a class or a series, please feel free to reach out. You can email us at info@sephardicbrother.com to sponsor the series either in honor of someone, in memory of someone, or on behalf of a specific business or institution. With that being said, I'm going to invite now Rabbi Mark Angel, a man who, of course, needs no introduction, to begin his class. Rabbi Angel, whenever you are ready.
Okay, thank you very much. You can all hear me now? Yes, we're good. First of all, it's been a great pleasure participating in this program, and I'd like to thank all of you who have emailed me, ordered my books, registered on our website. God bless you all. Thank you very much. If you haven't registered yet, please do so. It's jewishideas.org. There's no charge to register, and I think you'll find a lot of material of interest. During the week, I got an email from participants in this class, Mr. David Safan, S-A-F-F-A-N. Him and his wife are actually members of our institute. And he was doing research, his family's from Salonika, and he did some research on Salonika. And he found some documents going back to March 1923, which was the time when Rabbi Uziel, who is the subject of tonight's discussion, was the rabbi in Salonika. And I read that document very carefully, and it's heartbreaking. I don't want to break your heart. We have enough things to worry about, but I want to tell you this little story. It's a very powerful story. There were two young Jewish boys, young Jewish men. They had a little business, a junk business. They used to buy scrap metal. And among the things they bought were wires, cables, whatever it was. And the little Muslim kid said that he sold cables and wires to these Jewish boys, Jewish young men. And these cables and wires actually were part of the communication system of the government. And that this was really a threat to the safety of Greece, of Salonika. So they arrested these young men and they gave them a trial, which I'd call a mock trial. They had no chance to defend themselves really. And they convicted them to be shot. Well, they shot by a firing squad. And they decided to shoot them on Shabbat. And they sent a message to the chief rabbi to come and give them last rites. The rabbi said, Shabbat, well, at least wait. They didn't wait. They shot these two young men, killed them for selling wires, which they said they had no idea where these things came from. They never told anyone to do it. It was a complete frame-up by an anti-Semitic government people. Their names were Shabbatai Tiano and Jacob Amir. And who remembers that they even lived? Poor young men, they were shot in their early 20s. No one even remembers that they lived and died. So tonight's shiur, in memory of Rabbi Uziel, is also in memory of these two young men, Shabbatai Tiano, Jacob Amir. May they rest in peace. And they should know in the next world that they're not forgotten. They were victims of a horrible anti-Semitism that so many Jews have suffered over the generations. The day will come when the Almighty will redeem us and when we won't have to suffer from all these abuses. But in the meanwhile, we shouldn't forget those people of our faith, our people who perished innocently just because they were Jewish. So this is in memory of Shabbatai Tiano and Jacob Amir. May they rest in peace. Tonight's lecture is about Rabbi Uziel. Rabbi Uziel was born in 1880 in Jerusalem. He died in 1953. Most of his career, he was rabbi in Israel, mostly in Tel Aviv, and then later in 1939 became chief rabbi of Israel, Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel. He spent several years from 1921 to 1923 as rabbi in Salonika. The motto that he had hanging on his wall, which is actually the name of the book that I wrote about him, called Loving Truth and Peace. These are words from the prophet Zechariah. And Rabbi Uziel had those words as just a motto, loving truth and peace. And he commented in some of his writings that truth and peace, they sound like good things, but often they're in conflict with each other. If you're in favor of truth, you fight for the truth no matter where it leads you. Sometimes leading to fighting for truth, you get enemies. Sometimes you come to conclusions which do not conduce to peace. On the other hand, if you're always searching for peace, then you look for compromise. You compromise truth, you have to tell a few lies. How do you balance the search for truth and the search for peace? This was actually Rabbi Uziel's theme, and actually defined who he was as a posek, as a rabbi, and as a decisor of Jewish law. Sometimes people say, well, if there's a question in Jewish law, let's ask our rabbi. And what does the rabbi do? The rabbi goes and he looks at his bookcase, he pulls out all the books and he does homework, and he says, this is the ruling, the truth. There's another kind of rabbi, which I think Rabbi Uziel was the second kind of rabbi, that before answering the question, they look into the person's eye. Why are you asking me this question? What impact will my answer have on the way you live your life? Will my answer give you peace, give you happiness? Will it make you be a better person? Will it make you feel that you're observing the laws of the Torah more properly? Not to compromise the truth is the truth. At the same time, each of us comes to a text, or each of us comes to a situation with their own predispositions. Some people are predisposed to find strictness, and some people are predisposed to find a peaceful way of solving things. Not to compromise the texts, but to enlarge our discussion based on ethical, moral, and personal feelings. Let me tell a personal story. When I was a young rabbinical student way back in the olden days, I was a poor but honest student, and I used to go on Sunday mornings down to the Lower East Side of New York. They had a lot of Jewish bookstores in those days. I couldn't afford very much, but one day I'm in the bookstore and I see the top row, there's a shelf, there's a black volume. It says Mishpatei Uziel, the judgments of Uziel. Now, I knew about Rabbi Uziel. Why? Because my rabbi in Seattle when I was a boy was Rabbi Abraham Shalem, who was a student of Rabbi Uziel, and he quoted Rabbi Uziel. So I knew about Rabbi Uziel, but I didn't know much, just a little bit. I pulled the book down. I think it cost $2.75 or $3, whatever it was. I could afford it. So I bought the book. That book changed my life, literally. I read this book of responsa, rabbinic responsa, and my eyes suddenly, as if God shined his countenance on me, light went on. Why? Many rabbis, when they get questions, and I was a rabbinical student in those days, so I was reading many rabbinical works, they're very legalistic, dry as dust, pardon the expression, very difficult, very tedious. They bring this source, that source, the next source, 5 Gemaras, 2, this opinion, that opinion, ooh, all kinds of commotion. Rabbi Uziel, who knew all the sources also, by the way, when he wrote, there's a human being writing. It's not a computer. It's not computer generated. There's a heart and a soul in his writing. There's an ethical sensitivity. There's a softness. Not that he always came to answers I would like, but you could see a mind, a heart, and a soul working over the sources. The goal was literally to find truth, but to find peace. So the first set of responsa that I read in this book of responsa from Rabbi Uziel dealt with the subject of conversion to Judaism. Now, when I was a rabbinical student, all of our teachers told us, you should never get involved in converting people because they're never going to be sincere. They're never going to be observant. Unless you're sure they're going to observe 100% of the mitzvot, it's forbidden to convert them. And if you convert them, the conversion is not valid. That's what we were all taught. And we thought that was the truth. I read Rabbi Uziel as an entirely different viewpoint. He says, if a man, he was asked questions, I'm just giving you this summary. If a man is married to a woman, a Jewish man is married to a non-Jewish woman, and he wants her to convert, so that they should have Jewish children and have a Jewish family. So in my education at yeshiva, that forget it. If she wants to convert for the sake of marriage, it's not to be discussed. Rabbi Uziel says, not only may you convert such a person, it's a mitzvah to convert such a person. It's an obligation on rabbis not to turn such people away. Why? Because if you turn them away, either they'll go to a non-Orthodox rabbi, they'll get converted not halakhically, or they'll stay married civilly. They're going to have children. All those children that they have will be lost to Judaism. It's better to create a Jewish family. It's better if they're coming to the Orthodox rabbi to convert. It means they have some kind of traditional sense. They want to be accepted within a halakhic framework. Otherwise, they wouldn't come to you. Don't turn those people away. See, of course, you try to teach them as much as you can. You try to get them as advanced as you can in terms of their observance and commitments. But when all said and done, Mr. Rabbi Uziel, you convert the woman. And if they have children, you convert the children. So someone asked, what happens if you know ahead of time? They're not going to be very observant. The husband himself isn't very observant. He doesn't care himself. He wants his wife to be Jewish to satisfy his parents, but he doesn't really care. Should you do the conversion then? Says Rabbi Uziel, you should. I'm not saying everyone agrees with Rabbi Uziel. There are many who don't agree with him. But for a young rabbinical student to suddenly come across a viewpoint like that was eye-opening. But what was important? What was the importance of that discussion? Rabbi Uziel looked at the very same passages of the Talmud as the other rabbis. Rabbi Uziel knew all of the literature on the subject just as the other rabbis did. And nevertheless, he took another factor into consideration. It's not just what the book says, yes, no, or not. It's what's good for the Jewish people. What's good for the Jewish family? What's good for these people in front of me? It's one thing to say theoretically, everything is forbidden. Fine, you could say it. But when you have people in front of you whose lives are literally at stake and the lives of their children are at stake, how do you simply say, well, go somewhere else. I'm not interested. I have no time for you. Rabbi Uziel introduced a new concept, namely ethics, morality, looking at a bigger picture. Ideally, we want everyone to be observant. Ideally, we want everyone to keep all the mitzvot 100%. Of course, we want that. And of course, we should work at that. That should be our ideal. But it's an ideal doesn't mean you can always reach the ideal. Because you can't reach the ideal doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything. If Rabbi Uziel were alive today, he would not be very happy with the current rabbinate. Because the current chief rabbinate in Israel, the current rabbinate in the Rabbinical Council of America, most of the Orthodox rabbinate, takes the most stringent possible views. They make it almost impossible for someone to convert. And if you convert the person not following their rules, they always cast doubts, they raise questions. Rabbi Uziel himself would say, not only should you convert such people, but those who don't accept the halakhic conversion, they're committing a terrible sin. According to the Talmud, if you oppress a convert, you're guilty of 39, and some people say 49 sins. If you tell the person who's a valid halakhic convert, you're not Jewish, I don't accept you, I'm not going to call you to the Torah, I'm not going to accept your wife, you're guilty of 39, maybe 49 sins. You're oppressing a convert. The Torah tells us we should love the convert. This kind of feeling exuded from the writings of Rabbi Uziel and literally changed my understanding of halakha. Halakha isn't just a matter of finding yes, no, truth and falseness, checking this source, checking that source. It's also trying to consider human condition, human situation. It doesn't mean to change the law. If the law says no and there's no other way out, it's no. The law isn't totally flexible. So some things are yes and some things are no. There are yes and no answers. But many questions are not yes and no questions. They're questions of judgment. And the rabbi has to bring his, and I could say today, her judgment into the situation. It's not black and white. It requires an analysis, a subtlety, a carefulness. Rabbi Uziel had a principle that guided him, which should guide every rabbi. It's called Mipnei Darchei Shalom. The Torah was given to us for the sake of peace. Darchei Darchei Noam. The way of the Torah is ways of pleasantness. If the law comes out to you and it sounds strident or ugly, you probably were taught wrong. The Torah by nature should should be sweet, should teach us something sweet. So he had a question. Here's a question of technical law. There was a Jewish man who had a non-Jewish girlfriend, and she became pregnant and had a baby. So the man, who's the father of this child, goes to his rabbi and says, Rabbi, am I obligated to provide financially for this baby that's born? Because after all, the baby is born to a non-Jewish woman. That's not legally my wife. According to Halakha, you can't marry a non-Jewish woman. According to the Jewish law, the child is not Jewish. Am I obligated to provide financially for that child? So the rabbi said, checked all the books and said, no, that's not your child. Legally, it's not your child. It's a non-Jewish child. It's her problem. She got pregnant. She had the baby. You're free as a bird. The question came to Rabbi Uziel. Rabbi Uziel said, this is not a question of technicality. Are you responsible? Are you not responsible? Go step back a minute. Is it possible to imagine that the Torah would allow a man to be a scoundrel and have a baby by this woman and then abandon the child? The Torah, which always demands us the highest ethical standard, could never allow such a thing, couldn't tolerate such a thing. So the first rabbi was able to look at books and find source to justify the man not paying childcare. And Rabbi Uziel said, you started from the wrong perspective. The perspective of the Torah is the Torah has to be the way of kindness, the way of gentleness, the way of peace. And if you could come up with a law that frees a man from taking care financially of his own child, that he admits it's his own child, this is not kindness, this is not gentleness. The Torah could not possibly stand for that. So Rabbi Uziel made the man pay, and correctly so. But these are several examples, and I want to go a little further to some other of his responsa, how he differed in certain ways from other people. But before I go to responsa, I want to talk about a story that was told by his disciple, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who later became the Sephardic chief rabbi in Tel Aviv, and was one of my favorite teachers and one of my favorite rabbis also. He just died in late 1998. Rabbi Halevi was then like an assistant to Rabbi Uziel. And he tells the following story. When the state of Israel was founded, Rabbi Uziel and Rabbi Herzog, who were both two chief rabbis, they called a big gathering of the Jewish community, a massive rally, in favor of Shabbat observance. They wanted everyone to keep Shabbat. They wanted factories to be closed on Shabbat. They wanted stores to be closed on Shabbat. They wanted the buses not to run on Shabbat. They wanted the Jewish state to be governed by Shabbat. They wanted Shabbat rules to be observed by everyone that they could. And when Rabbi Uziel gave his little talk, he literally had tears in his eyes about the holiness of the Sabbath. After that tremendous event, Rabbi Uziel was led by his students to a taxi cab to go back to his office. In those days, there were great gas shortages in Israel, and the taxi drivers had to take off 1 day a week. They were not allowed to drive at least 1 day a week. And on every windshield, it said what day they do not drive. So every religious Jew, observant Shabbat Jew, they have the letter Shin on their window. Shin means that Shabbat, they don't drive on Shabbat. But if they had Gimel, that means they don't drive on Tuesday. It means they do drive on Saturday. So it happens when Rabbi Uziel went to the car, it was a Gimel or a Dalet, it was not a Shin. The person who drove that cab was a person who drives on Shabbat. So Rabbi Uziel opens the door to get in the cab. So students say, Rabbi, how could you get in a cab? You just made a big speech about Shabbat observance, and you're going to get in a cab of a person who breaks Shabbat? Rabbi Uziel says, I'll talk to you later. He gets in the cab, goes to his office. Later, the students come to him. Rabbi Uziel, you're the one who spoke so passionately about the importance of Shabbat. You cried, you made a big deal about Shabbat. And nevertheless, you got in a cab of a cab driver who breaks Shabbat? Couldn't you wait a little longer to find a cab driver who keeps Shabbat? Rabbi Uziel said, we already stopped that taxi. If I didn't get in, it would have been an insult to him. And it's more important not to insult a Jew than to be in favor of Shabbat. Just because I think he should keep Shabbat, which I think he should, I'm not going to humiliate him in public. And in any case, when I got in the cab, I talked to him. I told him I'm the rabbi. Come to my office if you need something. If I slammed the door on him, do you think he ever would be a Shomer Shabbat? Do you think he ever would feel any reverence for the Shabbat? He wouldn't. This way, look, you talk to him, you find a way of creating continuity, a way of finding relationship with him. And in this way, you bring people closer to the Torah. Tells Rabbi Uziel. Truth, yes, truth, we should keep Shabbat. He made a profound speech on Shabbat. But peace, you have to combine these two factors. Just because you believe in Shabbat doesn't mean you can spit on somebody else or humiliate somebody else. This is Rabbi Uziel's wisdom. Let me just carry it a little bit, a generation later, with the student Rabbi Chaim David Halevi. When Rabbi Halevi was rabbi in Tel Aviv, in the next town, they started showing movies on Friday nights in Petach Tikva. And so the Haredi Jews started making protests. They marched every Friday night. They would come in front of the movie theater and they would yell, Shabbos, Shabbos. Most of them were Ashkenazim, obviously. They called Shabbos, Shabbos. They didn't say Shabbat, Shabbat. So what happens? They did this for over a year. And what happens? The theater every Friday night filled up. No one got discouraged. They all came to spite those guys. The theater got filled. So the rabbi of the town told everyone, no more protests. Doesn't help at all. And they said, what kind of rabbi are you? Don't you stand up for Shabbat? So this poor rabbi calls Rabbi Halevi, who's older. Rabbi Halevi, what should I do? Rabbi Halevi said, you did the right thing. These people who are protesting, they're well-meaning. They want people to observe Shabbat. But when they go and protest, it makes more people break Shabbat. The media comes there, the police have to come there, all kinds of tourists come there. People go to the movies and ordinarily would stay home. They go to the movies just to spite these guys. What is being gained by that? Okay, we have to protest. They protested, but the protest is not going to succeed. What should they do? Instead of protesting, they should stand out there and everyone who comes to the movie say, listen, why don't you come to my house for Friday night dinner? I'll show you a real Shabbat time. Bring them home. Let them see what Shabbat's all about. Once they see Shabbat, maybe they'll like it. Maybe they'll realize there's a holiness and there's a grandeur, much more important, much more beautiful than any movie could be. The way you win people over isn't by yelling at them and calling them names and insulting them and making demonstrations. The way you convince people is sweetness, shalom. You're my brother, you're my sister, I love you. Try to experience Shabbat with me. You're invited. Please, you'll have a wonderful, my wife is a great cook. We'll sing good songs. You'll have a wonderful time. And maybe in this way, people will be drawn closer to the religion. Rabbi Uziel had a contemporary, older contemporary, Rabbi Kook. And Rav Kook was a great man. Avram Yitzchak Kook was a very, very great man. No complaints, no comment about that. It's for sure, he was a great man. And he's still very, very revered in Israel. He died in 1935. He's still highly revered and his works are very, very powerful. Rabbi Kook, for example, absolutely forbade conversions unless you knew 100% the person was going to be observant. 100%. And if one person wasn't 100% observant, you can't convert them. Rabbi Uziel, who was a younger contemporary, came to an entirely different conclusion, although he respected Rabbi Kook. And as I said before, he's tried to factor in not just loyalty to the letter of the law, but loyalty to the spirit of the law, to the spirit of the people, to the needs of the people, to the needs of Jewish families. The question between Rabbi Uziel and Rav Kook went beyond just the question of conversion. Question in those days, in the early 20th century, like 1919, 1920, they were talking about establishing a Jewish medical school. They established the Hebrew University, I think, in the early 1920s, and they're thinking of making a medical school also. In a medical school, you have to have autopsies. For medical school students to learn what's inside the body, they need to do autopsies. Where are the bodies going to come from? Where are the bodies going to come from? So Rabbi Kook got this question. He said, what you do is you get non-Jewish bodies. What happens if no non-Jews want to donate their bodies to the Hebrew University? So you buy them. Goyim don't care. You buy them, and they'll for money they'll take you. They'll give you their bodies to do. How about Jewish bodies? Chas v'shalom. Jewish bodies are holy. They're sacred. You can never do an autopsy on a Jewish body. No. So the question came to Rabbi Uziel. Rabbi Uziel said, here's a strange thing. When God created the world, he created Adam, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. It doesn't say he created Jews in the image of God. It said he created human beings in the image of God. There is no essential difference between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person, essentially. We have different religion, they have a different religion, we have different beliefs, different customs, but as human beings, we're identical. We have equal holiness because all of us are created in the image of God and all of us are answerable to the Almighty. So Rabbi Uziel went through all of the various sources and he says, in order to train doctors, you have to have autopsies. If it somehow was announced that we will not allow Jewish bodies to have autopsies and will only use non-Jewish things, this is going to cause such anti-Semitism. What are people going to think about us? We're too holy, we're too good for it. We'll take your bodies are nothing. What kind of, from a PR point of view, it's hard to imagine something that's uglier than that. Rabbi Uziel said, not only should one not say such a thing, not only should one not write such a thing, one shouldn't even think such a thing. Because after all, since all human beings are created in the image of God, if it's permissible to do an autopsy on a non-Jew, it's permissible to do on a Jew. If it's not permissible to do on a Jew, then it's not permissible to do on a non-Jew. It has to be equal. But we know in order to train a doctor, there have to be autopsies. He says, yes, they should be done in a dignified way, not as a joke, carefully, as though you're doing a real surgery on a person, and when they're done, you sew them up nice and neat and give them a proper burial afterwards. I mean, if it's done in a respectful way, that's not considered nivul hamed. It's not considered a desecration of the dead body because it's done for the sake of education, for the sake of learning, and so that these people can be proper doctors. None of us want to have an operation by someone who never saw the inside of a body. We don't want a heart transplant by someone who never saw a heart. So you have to be able to have the training. So Rabbi Uziel permitted it, but he was modest. Even though he gave all the arguments to permit it, he said, I do not rule against Rabbi Kook unless other rabbis agree with me. Ultimately, the founders of the Jewish medical school couldn't care less what the halacha demands. They were going to do it their own way anyway. And anyone who would donate a body, that's the body they use. But Rabbi Uziel provided the halakhic framework, which was a practical framework for it. He did another thing. There was a question in the early, let's say 1919, 1920, there were just little villages, little communes of Jews in the land of Israel. They were just starting to develop societies. And each little town, each little village had a council that governed them. The question came up, may women vote for members of this council who govern their community? Well, let's go back a bit. In those days, even in the United States, I don't think women could vote. A lot of countries, when this was under discussion, a lot of countries in the world, women were not allowed to vote. So it was, in that day, it was a very big question, a burning question, a very avant-garde question. May women vote? And then there was a second question. Even if women are allowed to vote, may they be elected? Okay. The question came to Rav Kook, Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. He said, absolutely not. Women may not vote. And certainly they may not hold public office. Why may they not vote? Because if they vote, it'll cause divorce. Why? Because they'll want to vote for Trump and the other one wants to vote for Biden. They hate each other, they'll fight a big fight, and you're going to get divorced, right? So it's better to have one vote per household, and the man makes the vote. Also, he said, when they go to the polling places, it's not moral. Men and women standing in line together, they're chatting, who knows where it's going to end up. Various arguments such as that. And to be elected, of course, they should never have a situation, said Rav Kook, where a woman is in office over men. How could men be subject to the rule of women? I don't know. Okay, I'm not going to go into personal comments on this, but he had a very strong opinion, and that was a widely held opinion. It wasn't just his opinion. The question comes to Rav Uziel, who's also, Rabbi Uziel didn't go to Yeshiva University, he didn't go to Harvard, he wasn't a modern rabbi, he was an old-time rabbi. Whatever secular knowledge he had, it was from his own reading. He wasn't formally trained at a university, but he had profound wisdom and knowledge. Question came to Rabbi Uziel, and he said, let's stand back a moment. Forgetting the legal technicalities, is it ethical to have people obligated to pay taxes or to follow rules if they didn't have a voice in electing the people to office? The answer is it's not ethical. Forgetting male, female, it's simply not ethical to ask someone to be responsible to pay taxes, to follow the community's rulings, if they had no voice in it. We're not slaves, we're human beings. We're created in the image of God. Everyone is, men and women. So we have to start from that premise. The premise is everyone has a right. Now, women, why should women not be allowed to vote? Don't start from the premise that women are not allowed to vote and why should they be allowed? Start the other way around. What in the world prevents us from allowing women to vote? So Rav Kook had explanations because it'll have create divorce, dissension in the household. Rabbi Uziel says husbands and wife often disagree on things. They don't get divorced over it. It's not likely that it's not a reasonable reason to deprive women of the right to vote. Or you could say one vote per household, either the husband or the wife. Why should the wife be deprived? Let the husband stay home and let the woman go to vote. So that Rabbi Uziel knocked off. Rabbi Kook said, but if they're in the polling places, they talk to each other, they gossip, men and women are on the same line, it's not moral. Rabbi Uziel said, people are going to vote. They're not going to flirt, not going for frivolity. We have supermarkets. Men and women are shopping together. Does anyone say that they're not allowed to be in the same supermarket? Does anyone say you're not allowed to walk on the same sidewalk, men and women? Does anyone say you're not allowed to get in the same bus, men and women? Although Charedim put the women in the back. But it's common in our society for men and women to be in the same place, and no one says boo. So why only when it comes to voting is suddenly a question of immorality? So it's not a valid argument. Absolutely, by moral law, women have exactly the same obligation and exactly the same right as men to vote. Now, what about to get elected? You'll find sources in the texts, in Rambam, in the Gemara, that really don't like the idea of women having position of power over men. There's no question about it. You know, they wrote at a different time. I'm not going to justify it, but there's definitely, you'll find plenty of sources that will make it clear women should not have authority over men. Rabbi Uziel knows the same sources. They're not very secret sources. They're pretty obvious sources. But he found another source. He found in medieval Spain, there was a practice in some communities that allowed women to have positions of authority over men. Why? Because there's a principle. Let me take 2 minutes as an aside. Let's say I have a case, a legal case, me against Mr. X. And I say to Mr. X, I want my son to be the judge. Is my son allowed to be the judge? No, he's my relative. We assume that if someone's related to one of the parties, that the person has an automatic prejudice in favor of the relative. What happens if Mr. X says, I know your son, he's entirely trustworthy, I accept him as my judge? According to Halakha, in that situation, is my son allowed to be the judge? The answer is yes. If there's an ad hoc situation, not a formal legal situation, but it's an ad hoc situation where all the parties agree that we'll accept my son to be the judge, then it's okay. If members of a society agree that a certain person, male, female, relative, not relative, is chairman of a committee or head of the community council, if the community at large agrees, then you're allowed to do it. Not because the halakha itself straight allows it doesn't, but because once we as a democratic group, the halakha recognizes such a thing, there's a democratic group that agrees, we put the halakha aside for this, and voluntarily we accept the authority of this person. So Rabbi Uziel said, if there's an election and a woman wins the election, that's proof that the society accepts her as authority. Their minority doesn't accept. We live in a society where majority rules, except in the United States right now, where there's still fights over the election. But normally speaking, when there's an election, someone wins and someone loses, and that's the end of the story. But the minority that loses, they can't say, well, I lose, I'm not going to follow the rules. No, they have to follow the rules. That's part of the system. So Rabbi Uziel says, not only may women vote, women may be elected. Whoa. This was saying this in the early 1920s, 1930s is amazing, amazing insight. But he didn't base it on the halakhic sources per se. He based it on an ethical feeling. It's not legitimate. It's not right from a moral point of view to deprive any group of people, regardless of their religion or regardless of their gender, from positions of power if the community accepts it as such. Now here, I'll take this even one step further. He was asked himself a theoretical question. Before there was a state of Israel, the question came up in his mind, what happens when we have a state of Israel and we have courts? And let's say the courts all run according to rabbinic law. They don't, but he's optimistic in a sense. He thought what if the courts all run according to halakha? Can a woman be a witness? Generally speaking, I hate to tell you this, folks, no, a woman's not a valid witness. Can a non-Jew be a witness? No, of course not. Can a non-religious Jew, a person who doesn't keep Shabbat, can they be a witness? No, absolutely not. Rabbi Uziel says, okay, I know the sources, they're all there, but I also know something else. When we Jewish people lived in all the lands of our dispersion over all these generations, and we were told Jews can't vote, Jews can't be witnesses, how did we feel? You can't be a witness. You saw a crime, you saw a thing, and you go to court and say, you're a Jew, we don't listen to you. How did we feel? Wasn't it an abuse of our personality, our humanity? And knowing what it feels like to be rejected, can we, with full conscience, abuse other people? Can we tell them, you know what, you're a woman, you're not Jewish, you're not religious, poof, we don't listen to your word. The guy says, I saw Mr. A shoot Mr. B. I'm sorry, you're not Jewish, we can't listen to your testimony. What? This person says he's a citizen of this country, he's paying his taxes, he can't testify, or she's paying her taxes, she can't testify? So Rabbi Uziel starts his response on, my friends, we have to find within halakha permission for such people to vote, not to vote, to testify in our courts. In religious things, no, they shouldn't sign a ketuvah, they shouldn't sign a get. Fine, there are religious rituals, they're out. There's no discussion there. But on civil cases, it doesn't matter if they're Jewish or not Jewish. It doesn't matter if they're male or female. It doesn't matter if they keep Shabbat or don't keep Shabbat. If their testimony is valid, it's valid. If it's not valid, it's not valid. It has nothing to do with their gender or their religion or the level of religious observance. You cross-question them. If you find out they're telling the truth, it's the truth. You accept it. How can that be? It's against the halakha. So he answers again. If a society willingly decides to put those halakhic rules to the side and govern themselves by a democratic system, they're allowed to do so. It doesn't mean all societies want to do that. It doesn't mean it's good in every situation. But if we're establishing our own Jewish state, shouldn't we try to establish it according to the highest moral principles, that all citizens should feel rights? Oh, Rabbi Uziel, God bless your soul. I'll tell you something else. When Rabbi Uziel was elected chief rabbi of Israel in 1939, he made a speech, in Hebrew, of course, to the people about being the chief rabbi, how he's honored, etc., etc. And then towards the end of his speech, he switched into Arabic because he was very fluent in Arabic. He knew Arabic, he knew Turkish, he knew French, he knew Hebrew. He was a polyglot, he knew many things. And he switched into Arabic and he spoke to I'm going to quote, this is an English translation of what he said. We reach out our hands to you in peace, to his Arab brothers, pure and trustworthy. We say the land is stretched out before us. With joined hands, we will work it. We will uncover its treasures. We will live on as brothers who dwell together. Know and trust that the word of our God will rise forever. Make peace with us, and we will make peace with you. Together, all of us will benefit from the blessing of God on his land. With quiet and peace, with love and fellowship, with goodwill and pure heart, we will find the way of peace. What chief rabbi today says those things? What anybody says those things? Now there are some voices coming out. The chief rabbi of Israel recognized, I'm not just the chief rabbi of the Jews. The non-Jews have a claim to me also. And I want them to know that this state belongs to all of us. And there's room for all of us to grow together. And in harmony, we can build a beautiful Jewish state. He wanted to be a Jewish state. He didn't want a multinational state. But non-Jewish citizens were to be recognized as full, wonderful citizens of the country, as our brothers, as our partners in building a land of Israel. To be able to reach out like that and to speak in Arabic, to go halfway to them, That's a rarity. That's something that's characteristic of Rav Uziel. His student, well, before I get to his student, the question came up when Israel was established, which is also something new, right? We haven't had a Jewish state for almost 1900 years. The question was, should we say Hallel? Should we have special prayers when we say Hallel, which is prayers we normally say on holidays? And not only should we say Hallel, but should we say Hallel with a blessing? Now, I wrote a short article about this some years ago. When I was a young rabbi, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, of blessed memory, came to New York when he was first elected as chief rabbi of Israel, Sephardic chief rabbi. And he made a speech. And what was his speech? His speech was, we should not say the Hallel with a blessing on Yom HaAtzmaut. Here was a chief rabbi from Israel coming to us who love Israel, who want to hear good words from the chief rabbi of Israel. He says, if you want to say Hallel, say it, but no blessing. Why shouldn't we say a blessing? If we're thanking God. No. Because if you look at the books, there's no precedent there's no precedent justifying saying Hallel, saying a blessing on Hallel. The rabbis made a blessing for Pesach. They made a blessing for Sukkot. They didn't make a blessing for Yom. There was no Yom HaAtzmaut in those days. Well, there was Hanukkah. Okay, it's parallel, but Hanukkah is still different. There was a miracle. There's no miracle there. Whatever the story is. Rabbi Uziel, it's just the opposite. Yeah. Can we, after praying for hundreds and hundreds of years for a Jewish state, now we have a Jewish state, can we dare not say Hallel with a blessing? What kind of ingratitude could that be? It's like saying to God, oh God, please let me win the lottery. Please let me win the lottery. And finally, after 25 years, I get the lottery. I win. And the next day I come, please God, let me win the lottery. Please. I don't say thank you. As though nothing happened. Ladies and gentlemen, something happened. Something dramatic happened. The state of Israel is not an accident. It's a sign of God's providence. There's a miraculous element to it. Rabbi Uziel said, you say Hallel and you say the bracha. Oh, see, that's a vision. His student, who I mentioned before, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, he had a question about the mincha that we say on Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, it's a fast day lamenting the destructions of our temples in Jerusalem in ancient times. So the fast day says, God have mercy on us and on Jerusalem, the city which is desolate and empty of its children. So Rabbi Halevi says, how in the world can we say that blessing anymore? Jerusalem, hundreds of thousands of people live here. It's not desolate. It's not empty of its children at all. So he changed it. He said, God have mercy on Jerusalem that was desolate and that was bereft of its children. And he said, in many synagogues, they say all kinds of kinot, all kinds of elegies, long elegies lamenting the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Halevi said, cut them down. You should still say some. We still feel sad that we don't have the whole thing, but cut them down. We should recognize God did a wonderful thing for us, letting us have Israel. Yes, it took human sacrifice and human effort and human lives, soldiers. Nonetheless, the overall providence helped us get this achievement, and it's our responsibility to say, thank you. Don't sit down and mourn as if nothing happened. Don't pretend that everything is like it used to be. It's not so. So you have rabbis who try this way and that way to explain what it means that Jerusalem is desolate in a spiritual sense. It's just, you know what? Quit making all those explanations. Jerusalem is not desolate. Jerusalem is not empty of its children. Jerusalem is a thriving, beautiful, wonderful city. And let's say thank you to God that we live to merit to be alive at this generation of the restoration of the people of Israel in the land of Israel. So Rabbi Uziel and his students had this kind of sensitivity. I'm running out of time, but I want to just talk a little bit more about Rabbi Halevi, who I admired tremendously, and I had the honor to visit with him a number of times and correspond with him. He was my ideal sage. I didn't know Rabbi Uziel. Rabbi Uziel died in 1953. I was just a little boy then, but Rabbi Halevi I did know and learned from very much. I just want to give one case, again, to examine a Halakhic approach that tries to combine issues of truth and the issues of peace. So there was a bar mitzvah in some synagogue in Tel Aviv, and the family came to the synagogue, the bar mitzvah boy, etc. And one of the relatives was a soldier who was was a soldier who was in the tank corps of Israel's tank corps. And his tank, unfortunately, got hit by a missile. And in the process, there was a big fire, and he became blind. So this young fellow, poor fellow, He's blind. So the family comes to the rabbi and says, this is our nephew, and we want him to have an aliyah to the Torah in honor of the occasion. The rabbi said, but he's blind. Yes, he is blind. Well, it's against the rules to call a blind person to the Torah. It is, by the way. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch says a blind person is not allowed to be called to the Torah. Why? Because anyone who's called to the Torah is supposed to read. A blind person can't read. So blind person can't read from the Torah, the person can't be called. So the boy said, in my synagogue that I go to, which is a fine synagogue, my rabbi does call me to the Torah. So this other rabbi says, I don't care where you go, I don't care what the other rabbi does, it's wrong. I have the Shulchan Aruch right in front of me, and you cannot be called to the Torah. The family says, this boy gave his eyes to his country. He suffered so much. He came to celebrate a bar mitzvah. Why are you ruining it for us? Rabbi said, the law is a law, out. So the family was very upset, and they left in a huff. What a sad bar mitzvah day. The family later came to Rabbi Halevi. And Rabbi Halevi said, oh my goodness, what a terrible mistake that rabbi made. Yes, it does say in the Shulchan Aruch that a blind person can't be called. But if the rabbi was really learned, he would know that there are many other sources on the subject. And there are the Chidah and the many other sources that permit blind persons to be called to the Torah. Why? In the olden days, when people would be called to the Torah, they themselves would read from the Torah. But for many, many generations now, a Chazan reads. Doesn't matter if the person gets called can read or can't read, the Chazan reads anyway. So that's why you can call a person who's ignorant, doesn't know Hebrew, you can still call him to the Torah. A person is blind, you can still call him to the Torah. So the rabbi didn't even know the correct law. But more than that, even if what was going through his mind? This boy is telling him that in his own synagogue he's being called to the Torah, and his other rabbi lets him get called. Why doesn't he believe that? Why doesn't he accept that? Maybe the other rabbi did homework and found out that it's permissible. Rabbi Halevi says, when you're dealing with questions of Jewish law, you're not just dealing with what's the book says, this book says, and that book says. You can always find a source for anything. You're dealing with human beings. You're dealing with feelings. Sometimes I admit you're going to come to a negative answer, and that's going to be the end of the subject, and it's not pleasant. But more often than not, the ways of the Torah are ways of pleasantness. A proper rabbi will analyze the texts, but analyze, first of all, the human context. And unless there's a human context, everything else falls apart. So Rabbi Uziel stood for loving truth and peace. Not that we compromise truth, and not that we compromise peace, but we have to find a way of being faithful to the dictates of our religion, the dictates of the rules, and at the same time to apply them in a manner that shows humanity and sensitivity. And every time there's a ruling that makes the Torah sound cruel, it's a bad ruling. Not only because it's bad, but it's probably also mistaken, because there'll be other sources. If the person's wise enough and smart enough, they'll be able to find other sources that could put the thing into a better context. This is what I have to say tonight. And again, I want to just repeat that this lecture, the shiur tonight, was in memory of these two young men who were murdered, executed unfairly and murderously in Salonika in 1923. I'm not sure if Rabbi Uziel was a rabbi then. I think he was. It was March 1923. And we're not sure if maybe that was one of the reasons he decided to leave Salonika, because right after that period, he went back to Israel. He said, you know what, living in the diaspora is no fun. I'd rather be in the land of Israel where we can build the Jewish state in a better way. So those are what I have to say for tonight. Please, again, register for jewishideas.org. And if you have questions, I'd be very happy to entertain them at this time, okay? Ethan, you're up to bat here.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Angel. Thank you all so much as well. If you have any questions, as we always do, please enter them to the chat and we'll read as many as we can. I'm also putting to the chat right now our series surveys, because this is the end of the series. We always ask at the end of our series to please click a quick 2-minute survey, click on that little link, enter in just a few notes. It'd be very helpful for future classes, and we appreciate it as well. First question here, Rabbi Angel, can you speak a little bit about Rabbi Uziel's experience in Salonika during his time as chief rabbi?
When he came to Salonika, I don't know a whole lot about it. I read speeches that he gave when he was in Salonika. That's what I know about it. I don't know all the other issues. When he came to Salonika in 1921, many of the fancier Jews in Salonika were educating their children in non-Jewish schools. Why? They wanted the kids to be doctors and lawyers and accountants and be successful in life. And they thought if they just went to the Jewish school standard wasn't high enough, and they had just become stifled in their professional development. So Uziel made a speech to the congregation, to the community, and also to the Alliance Israélite Universelle, who had schools that were more upgraded and tried to train the people for in French culture and Western culture. And his basic point was this: we all want our children to grow up to be strong, beautiful, healthy, happy as human beings, but we also want them to be good Jews. So when we train them, we don't only want to train them to be doctors and lawyers and accountants and physicists, we want to train them to be good Jewish doctors and lawyers and physicists and whatever else. And in order for them to have the Jewish component, they have to have a proper Jewish education. You can't send them to secular schools and expect them they're going to be proper Jews. They're not. They'll drift away, and the Jewish core of their lives will diminish. He asked the Alliance schools, which tended to be secularistic, to put more emphasis on the Hebrew language. He taught them, he said, the future of the Jewish people, by the way, he thought, and it's probably correct in many ways, is going to be in the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, you got to know Hebrew. So the best thing you could do for your children is not teach them French, teach them Hebrew, because a lot of these kids are going to grow up and they're going to come to Israel and they're going to help build the land there. And it's good if they have an advantage of already knowing the language of the land. He was very strong, obviously, as a Zionist, and he was very influential in convincing Jews in Salonika to move to Israel. And especially it's famously known that a lot of Salonika workers were port workers. They worked on the harbors and the port of Salonika, and many of them came and they settled in Haifa and helped develop the port in Haifa. So Rabbi Uziel did have that impact. I don't think he was overall dramatically successful in other ways, because his heart really was in Israel. His heart wasn't in Salonika. He came to Salonika because he felt a moral responsibility to serve in the diaspora. But when he got there, I think he was not where he wanted to be. So he gave his heart and soul to it, but he realized it's a dead end. There's not going to be it's not going to fulfill his life. His life is in Israel, and I think he was not able to bring the right message to the people. I shouldn't say it. Some people it was the right message for some people, but for many people it wasn't. He wasn't able to convince them to change the overall patterns of their community.
Another question here from the chat, Rabbi. Do you believe what makes a rabbi great is that he can think outside of the box, in a sense, be flexible, but still keep the halakha?
I think any rabbi who thinks in the box only is not only a lousy rabbi, but it's a lousy human being. And doesn't only apply to rabbis. All of us need to think. I'm all in favor of thinking. And sometimes thinking leads us in wrong directions and makes us come up with cuckoo ideas. You know what? Do it anyway. You have to be able to realize the world changes. Everything isn't the same. We can't look back and say, well, they did it this way in 1700s, so we're going to do it the same way now. We can't. We don't live in 1700. Our thinking is different. Our life is different. So it doesn't mean we throw everything out. It doesn't mean that we are not reformed, God forbid. And I'm not a conservative, God forbid. Those who are reformed and conservative, let them live and be well. I'm not condemning them, but it's not what I am. I believe in a firm commitment to the traditional halakha, but the halakha has to breathe. It has to be alive. It has to recognize when there's change. To be able to go before God on Tisha B'Av and say, God, forgive us and have mercy on Jerusalem, which is a desolate city. How could you lie before God? God wants us to tell him lies? I mean, it's insane. There has to be an ability to adapt, to change. There are new situations where we don't live like in the same world as they lived in previous times. Not only physically, psychologically, and morally, we don't live in the same world. So we have to be able to adapt. In order to adapt, it requires flexibility of thinking. And when I discussed this in my Rambam lecture, when you have flexible thinking and free thinking, you're going to have people coming to different conclusions. Agreed. But it's much worse to lock ourselves into a box and it ends up imprisoning us and killing us. We want our children to grow and thrive, but they have to be allowed to think and to grow. They can't be put into a little box and told that you have to live the way our ancestors lived 300 years ago. It can't be, and it shouldn't be.
How would you respond to people who are skeptical of including morality in the making of halachic decisions because of the potential subjectivity of morality, along with the potential of a quote unquote slippery slope?
One of the great judges of the United States was Benjamin Nathan Cardozo. He was a member of Sheriff Israel. I'm a great admirer of his writings, his teachings. And he was a Supreme Court Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was a great jurist. And in his lectures on the nature of a judicial office, he said, many people say a judge has to be entirely objective. The answer is it's impossible. Each person brings his own knowledge, experience, sensitivities, morality. Everyone brings their own package to the equation. So we look at the same text, we're dealing with the same case, but there you can see in the United States Supreme Court, they're conservative and liberal. Not that they don't see the same text, not that they don't study the same precedents, they went to the same law schools, but they bring something different to it. They see something different about it. That's the nature of the game. When I was a student in yeshiva, I was told, we were all told in those days, that every rabbi who makes a decision is between them and God. God gives them a direct line, and they only decide. They're not affected by the society in which they live. They're not just affected by what they think. As we say in Ladino, bamias. It's not so. Every person brings his and her own life into every decision they make. And there's no sense denying that. Now, if you say, well, I only want peace, and I'm going to keep changing the rules to make it comfortable for people, that's also wrong. And Rabbi Uziel certainly was not in favor of that. There are laws, there are rules, there are restrictions. I'm not saying no, there certainly are. Nonetheless, having said that, there's a lot more latitude than we're often given as a choice. We're often told this is permitted, this is forbidden, and we're not told, just a second, what about this circumstance? What about that circumstance? What about looking at a broader picture? It's not always black and white. Very often it's gray. And very often each posek, each rabbi, each human being has to use his and her own judgment how to interpret those sources in a way that's meaningful for the situation today. I think it's a bluff. Anyone who says that you don't bring your own morality or your own feelings into the decision, that's a bluff. I don't believe it one iota.
We'll take one last question here. This is a double question, actually, that's come up multiple times. Maybe you can comment. You've mentioned the issues of Rabbi Uziel being steeped in tradition, but also open to the modern world and dealing with issues as they come. How can we deal with issues in the Israeli rabbinate to try to influence them or convince them to see the light and accept halakhically permissible conversions that happen in America, especially at a time when it feels like the schism between the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community seems to be growing significantly?
I'm only an angel. I'm not a prophet. I wish I could do more than I do. I write plenty on the subject. I've written a ton. We've worked very hard with rabbis in Israel, rabbis in the diaspora. Right now, the spiritual foundations of the Orthodox rabbinate, by and large, the establishment anyway, is my humble opinion, very, very negative, very difficult. They're afraid of their own shadow. They think that taking all the strict positions is a correct position. And if you take any other position, then you're a compromiser, you're weak. Rabbi Uziel, today, they wouldn't even pay attention to him. He's a reform rabbi. They wouldn't take him seriously. But Rabbi Uziel had it correct, though. Rabbi Uziel if there was a Rabbi Uziel alive now, he would teach them the truth. The problem is they don't listen. And each one, it's contagious. The idea of being stricter than thou, holier than thou, it's contagious. And rabbis are afraid to stand up. I think it's important for those individual rabbis who do speak up to feel the encouragement of the community. I started my institute in 2007 because I felt the orthodoxy was choking me. And Baruch Hashem, we've been in business for 13 years, and Baruch Hashem, many people support us, but the vast number of people don't support us. Most people don't. We have to just keep fighting and plugging away to give a message of a reason, intellectually vibrant, compassionate, inclusive Judaism. So help us, and not just us, but help all those rabbis, all those community leaders who are trying to espouse a vision that we've outlined tonight. They need your support. If the community at large will stand up, it'll be a help. It won't solve the problem tomorrow, but it will ultimately solve the problem. By the way, I am an optimist. Ultimately, we're going to win, but it's going to take a while.
with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I want to thank Rabbi Angel for his wonderful 4-part series in partnership with the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, for which he is director of and founder. This wonderful series has been brought to you through our Sephardic Digital Academy and the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America. I would remind you all, we put into the chat a brief 2-minute survey on Google Forms. Really appreciate it if you take it. Just give us some feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Any comments and what you thought of the course, as well as other courses you'd be interested in finding out more about. And as Rabbi Angel said, we need your support. We need your help to make sure we create a vibrant, in our case, certainly a vibrant Sephardic community. So if you're interested in getting more involved, interested in supporting us, interested in sponsoring a series, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to connect with you. We'd love to learn more from you in building a national and beautiful Sephardic community. With that, I want to thank Rabbi Angel again so much for this wonderful course. And I wish you all Nuchada Buena. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.